the anniversary, the 20th anniversary of the London bombings. With us here in the studio now is Dan Biddle, and Dan was one of the victims of the attack, and he was just, within touching distance from the leading suicide bomber, and when that bomb went off, it killed 6 people.
Yeah, and Dan appeared in the new Netflix documentary, Attack on London, hunting the 7/7 bombers, and we've got a clip of that for you right now.
I could feel somebody staring at me. It was just this really unnerving feeling. It was one of those stares where he didn't blink. He was totally fixated on what was in front of him, almost like he was staring through me. It was that intense. And then I was just about to go like, is there a problem, mate, what you're looking at? Just went to open my mouth to say it, and I just see his hand go, and then...
No, that was 20 years ago. You were 26 at the time, Dan. What's it like seeing that and hearing yourself recounted?
It's still really surreal. It's still a kind of strange thought to realise that I was right in the middle of what happened that day. And even though it's 20 years, it still feels like yesterday.
Yeah.
The pain and the emotional torment that goes with that is just as fresh now as when it just happened.
Mm. And when you think back to that morning, because you've written a book about that day and your experience since, you actually were considering not going into work that day.
Yeah, my whole story of 7/7 is what I kind of term as sliding door moments. There's so many opportunities that were presented to me to do something different, or to stick to my normal routine and not step outside of that. And yeah, there's countless times where if I would have made a different decision, then I wouldn't have been on that train at that time. If I'd have got up on time, if I hadn't missed my stop, there's so many things that I can think back on and think, if only I've done this, if only I've done that. But it serves no purpose now because what's happened has happened.
You were horrendously injured, but people died on that bus that day.
Yeah, I mean, from the area of the train that I was on when the bomb went off, I'm the only one that survived. He killed everybody around me. And that's incredibly tough to live with, to know that you survived something that everybody around you didn't. And I was pretty much laying in and amongst dead bodies and body parts for about an hour and 40 minutes before I was taken out the tunnel.
And what do you remember about the murderer, the suicide bomber? Obviously, you were about to say to him, have you got a problem? What are you looking at me for? And he put his hand on this bomb and it exploded. That was him. He was killed. He was out of the picture with that. But what do you remember about seeing him, the man who was setting out to murder people that day?
I think the most terrifying thing about it is just how calm he was. There wasn't a hesitation when he reached for the bag. When he was looking at me, it was as if he was looking through me. And it was all very calculated because he leant forward and looked along the carriage. And when I was interviewed by the anti-terrorist squad a few months later, they basically said he was looking to see where the biggest group of people were in the train. So it was a very evil, calculated act, but there was no fear, there was no hesitation. And the most scariest thing of all was he just looked like everybody else. There wasn't anything about him that I would look at.
Say he looks like a terrorist.
Yeah. There was no screaming or shouting or anything like that. It was just a very calm one action and he was out of the picture and I've had to live the rest of my life with the consequences of what he did.
Yeah.
The power from the blast, and you described this in the Netflix documentary that I was actually watching last night. You were thrown onto the tracks, weren't you? And you were saved. Tell us about that.
Yeah, because I was stood up, I was stood next to the bomber. When the bomb went off, it blew me through the train doors. So I basically hit the tunnel wall and then bounced back into the crawl space between the tunnel wall and the track. And I kind of landed at an angle. I thought I was going to die. I knew I was seriously injured. And I just started screaming for help. And I just heard this very deep South African accent shout back at me. He shouted, "What's your name?" And I didn't know if he was talking to me or somebody else, but I thought I'm just going to answer it and hope for the best. So I shouted, "It's Dan." He said, "My name's Adrian, keep talking and I'll find you." So where I was kind of tunnel wall side of the track, Adrian was the other side, so that the train was between us. And he had to crawl underneath the train and crawl through God knows what to come out the other side. And he was quite badly hurt as well. He had a severely lacerated head. he dislocated his shoulder and broke 2 ribs. So actually put his shoulder back in place before he crawled under the train to get to me. A truly remarkable human being.
And he pinched your artery, didn't he, to stop you from bleeding?
Yeah, so my left leg was blown clean off and I severed the femoral artery. My right leg from the knee down had been blown around 180 degrees and the bones had snapped and come through the shin. So when Adrian found me, he basically said to me, I'm not going to lie to you, Dan, this is really going to hurt. And I thought, I've been set on fire, I know I've lost one leg. The pole that I was leaning against, I pulled out of myself, and you're telling me this is going to hurt. And he wasn't wrong, because he basically forced his hand into what was left of the leg, found the artery and pinched it shut.
And the irony of all of this, you're going through this terrible pain and whatever, and for so many people above ground, they had no idea what was going on, because what was happening to you was concealed, and no one. It wasn't until the bus blew that people actually realised, you know, the general audience realised what was going on.
Yeah, it's still something that when I was writing the book, I had some photographs taken outside the station to go into the book, and I was sitting in the coffee shop in the entranceway to the station, and you sit there watching people walk past, and you just think you're totally oblivious to the horrors that went on down there and the lives that were lost. And I think for me, I just don't want it to be forgotten. I think it was such a huge event and such a tragedy.
But I was going to ask you that. Do you think it has been forgotten? And do you know, people get on with their lives, life moves on. You know, how do you think we are reminding people today, but then we're all going, 20 years ago, was that 20 years ago? Because we'd forgotten.
Yeah, I think if you look back over the last sort of 10 years since the 10th anniversary, it doesn't get mentioned on the news on the anniversary. No. It doesn't get mentioned in the newspapers. And I think if you look at the way that 9/11's remembered in this country, there's always something on about 9/11. We're constantly reminded about the atrocity that happened out there. And that happened in the States. And yet when it's on our own soil, in our own country, it's almost as if somebody just wants to wipe it from the public psyche, as if, oh, well, let's just make sure we can pretend it didn't happen. For some of us, we can't. We've got to live with that day every single day of the week.
And you've had to live with that day. How was the experience for you writing this book? I can imagine it's very painful, but also very cathartic.
Yeah, I think for me, because of the issues that I've had with complex PTSD and depression and the impact that's had on my life, I wanted to do something to kind of hopefully give a little bit of hope. And I coined the phrase turning trauma into triumph, to go from where I was 20 years ago and the horrendous state I was in to where I am now. And life isn't easy, and I really do struggle with my PTSD, but I'm still here. I'm still incredibly lucky to have a chance at a life. So I wanted to write the book to hopefully, for somebody that's struggling, to read that and go, yeah, there is a way through. With the right support and the right people, I can potentially come through the other side of it.
You're talking there about how personally this affects you, and obviously you can understand that. Do you think, though, do you ever think of the bigger picture, the security picture? Do you ever think that, are we actually a safer country as a result of the awfulness you went through, or does that not bother you?
No, it's on my mind all the time. I mean, after 7/7, me and a lot of other people were calling for a public inquiry. We constantly have that shut down. And I think the reason I don't think London is any safer is because we didn't have the public inquiry. And I think if you jump forward a few years, the shooting of John Charles de Menendez had a public inquiry. The Manchester attack had a public inquiry. Grenfell had a public inquiry. All were absolutely warranted and deserved it. 7/7 was the first attack of its kind in this country. It was the biggest loss of life in a terrorist attack. It was the first suicide attack. And there were clear failings, yet no public inquiry. So nobody has ever been able to turn around and say to me, 7/7 doesn't meet the criteria for a public inquiry, but these do, and this is where the difference is.
What do you think the failings were?
I think they know. I think they know that the intelligence services and the government made a horrendous mistake. I think the naivety and the arrogance of Tony Blair to think that you can go to war in a Middle Eastern country and it not have any repercussions on home soil. I think the fact that when Blair was interviewed, he turned around and said that there is no link between Al-Qaeda and the 7/7 attacks, yet when Khan made his suicide video, he openly states that that is the reason. So you kind of get lied to constantly, and I think that the hope is that you just start believing the lies. Well, some of us won't.
Well, Dan Biddle, thank you so much for coming into the studio and talking to us about your experience.
It's fascinating listening to you and all that you went through, and you know, it brings me back to where I was. I was on holiday and I was watching this on satellite television, and gripped him, and you just couldn't leave the television set, just wondering what was happening next, where the next explosion was going to be, and whatever. And yet it was like yesterday, that particular day. Do you think your life stopped that day, or have you been happy enough and successful enough to push things over?
The way I've had to deal with it is the Dan Biddle that I was at 8:52 on the 7th of July 2005 died at 8:52 on the 7th of July 2005, and I've had to reinvent myself, and everything that I was trained to do work-wise I can no longer do. So I've had to kind of start afresh. And I've been incredibly lucky that my wife, Jem, is an amazing support and gets me through so much of it.
Well, listen, you're an absolute credit, and it's really interesting talking to you and hearing all that you have to say. Continue to get well, continue to get better. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
And this is the book here, Back from the Dead, The Untold Story of the 7/7 bombings.
It's exactly 20 years today since those 7/7 London bombings, where 52 people died, more than 700 were injured, many of them with life-changing injuries. 4 suicide bombers detonated bombs on the London Underground and on a double-decker bus. And forget the double-decker bus was right outside the British Medical Association offices. There was a conference going on and doctors poured out of the building to help. I was in the south of France waiting for a plane to come back from a holiday, and the word was, because you couldn't ring into London. The mobile
network was down.
And the idea was it was a grid failure, and I absolutely know every instinct of my body said it's a bomb, but I thought 1. Who'd have thought 4?
What is remarkable, I know obviously we had the terror attack in Manchester Arena with Ariana Grande concert, but it's amazing that we've got to 20 years, touch wood, without something similar happening in any of our big cities in such a dramatic way. We've had some
lone wolves, haven't we?
Yeah, absolutely.
And the Ariana Grande was a shocker, 23 people.
But I think that says so much about our intelligence services and how much work must be going on behind the scenes every day to avert potential terror activities. And we're very grateful for those people.
Yeah, and you think how much easier it is now for these young men in particular to be radicalised. They can do it on the phone now.
Of course, it's remarkable.
We shouldn't forget the 4 killers. The most shocking part of the suicide bombers they were all homegrown. They were all born here.
I'd forgotten.
And had nursed some terrible grudge against this country with its democracy and its free speech. Yeah, all 4 of them were homegrown. I think the leader of the gang was from Yorkshire.
Yeah, that's right. And if you have memories of this day 20 years ago, because 20 years is a very significant event, I think, just get in touch this morning, let us know, gbnews.com/your say. Were you there in London that morning? We'd love to hear your stories. And do you feel safe now? Do you feel safer now on the streets of London than maybe you did 20 years ago?
And if you remember the extraordinary juxtaposition, the day before we learnt that Britain had won the bid for the Olympic Games in 2012.
Yes,
so that extraordinary juxtaposition, the joy, people were so happy. And on the very morning, the next day, Sir Ian Blair, I think, was the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, was on the BBC radio talking about how the Olympics would pose a risk to security, but how the police would be up to it. And even as he was speaking, those terrible monsters were on their way to plant living hell in London.
Amazing.
Amazing, wasn't it?
King Charles has released a message of unity, asking people to stand united against those who would seek to divide us. Is Britain safer now, do you think, in your opinion, than it was back in 2005?
I tell you what, if you're a Jewish man or woman, you wouldn't think so, because they have to avoid city centres like London because of those pro-Palestine marches.
Let's speak now to former British Transport Police Officer Gary Hayes, who joins us this morning. Good morning, Gary. Thank you so much for joining us. Commiserations to you as well in your sympathies on this day. I imagine it's incredibly poignant every time 7/7 comes around for you. Just tell our viewers and our listeners what you were doing that day, Gary.
Yeah, good morning, thank you. Well, on that day I was actually on paternity leave. My wife had just had our 3rd son. However, I was informed of the ensuing dramas that were taking place. I came back into work the following day and was basically put onto or became part of the resilience team at the temporary mortuary at the HAC to help identify the 52 victims and clearly what was left of the bombers.
And that was a gruesome exercise, Gary, wasn't it? The like of which, as a police officer, you probably never prepare for something of that magnitude. Working in the transport police, you will have seen awful accidents on motorways. But give us an idea of the scale of the task that you were faced with that day.
It was horrific. I mean, unfortunately, the victims have been down in the tunnels and on the crime scenes for a few days. If you remember, it was very, very hot, so decomposition was a huge factor when the deceased were being delivered to us, and clearly the blast injuries. It was something that, quite clearly, as you just said, I wasn't prepared for, and it's left a lasting legacy with me.
Yeah, and you have PTSD from this, Gary, don't you? You've talked about having post-traumatic stress. Just because it is important on days like today that we recognise the work of our emergency services and our first responders and the toll that it takes on you. What has that been like for you, and how does it manifest itself?
For me, as soon as I finished the tour of duty at the HAC, it was just straight back to normal duties. There was no decompression, and obviously the work that we'd undertaken during that period of time had really sort of burnt its picture into my memory. Over the years, I just started to slip down a very dark hole. I was a proud man, too proud to ask for any help, didn't really understand what was going on, but we dress PTSD up as a sign of weakness, and we shouldn't. You know, every officer from that day to this day suffers a daily occurrence of trauma, and I would actively encourage officers to talk to someone, to talk to my charity, PTSD 999. That's what we're here for. That's the whole reason we set this up, because I had no help, and it almost took my life. So with that in mind, it's just, you know, something that we should encourage our emergency services to talk about and encourage their officers to speak, especially after they've been to a traumatic event.
Gary, you said there it almost took your life. Did you actually contemplate taking your own life? Were the nightmares too much?
Yes. It just became overwhelming. I was drinking, I become very short-tempered, for want of a better word, and my tolerance to the public there was nothing there. I would turn up at jobs, and you know, basically, I just couldn't deal with certain situations. I would just have this huge outburst of anger, and it's, you know, all back really to 20 years ago and what we did. You know, I'm not ashamed to admit that now, whereas before, you know, everyone builds this picture of you as this strong individual, as a leader and everything else. But it crucified me, you know, to the point where I lost my job.
Oh, did you?
And, you know.
If you'd had therapy, Gary, early on, do you think that would have made a difference?
I think if generically there'd been something in place to help officers understand the signs and symptoms around PTSD and the connotations of what it can do, and just encourage, especially the guys, because we're the worst. We don't talk about our emotions. You know, for the ladies, you know, they can often, dare we say, just lean across the fence, but equally, there are women that can't talk, just like the guys. And statistically, we are the worst. So, you know, if there was something in place that, you know, the emergency services could use as a tool, we give an awareness presentation highlighting the signs and symptoms and the long-term effects of PTSD. You know, let's engage, let's help our officers now. It's 20 years is too late. It's like any big anniversary. We always talk about that sad event and then knock-on effects, but we're still not doing enough to help our officers, and that's the whole reason PTSD 999's here, to help the officers and their families get through some dreadful times.
Let's think about it in a slightly today. Let's look for some optimism here, Gary, because we were reflecting on the fact that it is remarkable that we've got to 20 years after this event in one of the busiest cities in the world, and we haven't seen something similar. I don't even want to tempt fate by saying that, but that has to be testimony, doesn't it, to our intelligence services who are working behind the scenes to avert any attack.
Absolutely. Our security services, our emergency services, they are the best in the world, there is no doubt. You know, every day is a challenging day within that environment, because they're deterring crimes that you and I will never ever get to hear about, preventing these sort of atrocities. You know, 20 years ago, this terrible incident took place, and it changed, from my humble point of view, the style of policing, especially on the rail network. And, you know, it basically opened up a whole new set of scenarios for us as emergency services and as security services to deal with. And thankfully, everyone's remained professional and they've been on the game.
Do you think, Gary, do you feel we're safer now and better prepared than we were 20 years ago?
I would like to say yes, but clearly with the way that acts of terrorism take place nowadays, there is no defined way of identifying that something's going to happen. The security services are aware of incidents, I'm sure, and the possibilities of events, and they're on it, and they're preventing these things from happening. But sadly, people get through the net and atrocities take place. But thankfully, in the last 20 years, I know in recent years we've had the London bombings and the Manchester Arena events. But I guess in the long term, it's been, everyone's been on top of it and clearly saved many, many lives.
All right, Gary, thanks for joining us. That's former British Transport Police Officer Gary Hayes.